Welcome to the July 3rd Thursday Web Forum. As always, I'm Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint user support and communications for your cooperative. And the South Atlantic LCC hosts this Web Forum every month as a chance for you to provide input and help ask questions and guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic region. So if you're a regular to our web forums, this agenda looks the same as it does every month. I start out just by introducing our presenter and the topic. We'll hear from our speaker for 30 to 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for some Q&A and discussion about that presentation. I'll give a quick preview of next month's webinar, if you know what you can look forward to, and some updates from LCC staff, and then we'll pause at the end again for any questions and open discussion. So before I hand things off to Anne and John, just a few logistics. I'm going to put the conference in silent mode just to minimize any background noise. So that means that if you have questions, the best thing to do is to press *6 to unmute yourself to speak up, or you can use the chat box. And if you do want to use the chat box, just remember to use that drop-down menu and send the note to everyone. Otherwise, I'm the only person who will be able to see it. So does anyone have any questions before I mute us? Alrighty.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So presenting today, we have Anne Chazal and John Oetting. Anne is with the Virginia Department of Natural Heritage, and John's with the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. And they're going to be giving us an update on a project to develop some species distribution models for rare species and help incorporate those into the conservation blueprint. So with that, Anne, I'm going to pass presenter power over to you. And just hit *6 to unmute, and you can seize the day here.
All right, can you hear me?
I sure can.
All right, can you see the screen?
I sure can.
Okay, good.
You're 2 for 2.
All right. I like that. So thanks for the opportunity to come. John Oetting and I will both be presenting today, and just to give you an update on the work we've been doing on some species distribution modeling for the South Atlantic. But before we really dive into it, I just want to point out that this has just taken a big team effort. Several people at Florida Natural Areas and here at Virginia Natural Heritage Program, but we've also have folks from New York and Pennsylvania Heritage, which you're like, why? So, because right about the same time we got the contract to do this work for the South Atlantic, we also received money from Fish and Wildlife Service from Region 5 to develop this distribution models from Maine to Virginia for this set of species. So we just took advantage of the network and the capabilities, and we all worked together to kind of come up with unified methodologies and environmental data that we use. So all of us have been in on this together. But speaking specifically towards the work we're doing for the South Atlantic, our goals are kind of twofold. First, the immediate goal is to improve the connection between at-risk and range-restricted species to the conservation blueprint by building these models of their potential habitat. So this is going to help highlight important areas for imperiled species across the region. The longer-term goal, hopefully, is to begin to build and maintain a library of species models that we can use and that they can be iteratively improved over time. So I'm going to give a very quick overview. We're going to touch on how the species were chosen, just highlight how the data development process went, gloss over the modeling methods, and take a brief look at the deliverable. So it's pretty high end here, trying to stay out of the weeds as much as possible. I'll do some of this. John is going to discuss the results part in a minute. So first, talking about how did we select the species. There are over 1,000 plant and animal species that are tracked by natural heritage programs within the South Atlantic LCC. We wanted to focus on just at-risk and range-restricted species, so we did a first cut of taking only our G1 ranked species, the Nature Service signs, or species that were federally listed, which would include candidate potential listings and similar sort of categories. Once we got to that 160 or so species, we narrowed it further. First, we removed species that required different sort of modeling methods. For example, aquatic species or riverine species would take a different kind of modeling approach. And we also determined that maybe marine species or shoreline species would also take something. We just didn't have the time or the budget to develop different sorts of modeling. So we're sticking with terrestrial species. And then we looked over the listed species, and we removed everything that has a global rank from NatureServe that was G3 through G5. So we just kept G1 and G2. And that left us, we also removed data deficient species, things that have so few known localities and just practically nothing is known about life history that very hard to develop conservation measures for. We removed those. So that left us with 27 species, and we had a little back and forth with the South Atlantic. A few members that RUA pulled together a team to go over, and we cut it down to these 10 species that were decided upon. So very, very high end. What is a species distribution model? It's kind of the same. It's the same as a habitat suitability model. So it's very important to remember that it's modeling similar habitat. It's not modeling species occurrence. It's a very important distinction to make. And the input basically take known locations, or a lot of times I'll refer to that as an element occurrence or an EO, which is kind of heritage jargon, but an EO is the known location. And from that, we develop presence points. We take a random set of background points or pseudo absences that we refer to as absence points, and then develop the environmental variables, which are things like slope and aspect and elevation, all those predictor layers that you're probably very familiar with. All of those were developed at a 30-meter resolution. And then we decided to use random forest, which is an inductive modeling method, taking known locations and understanding the variables that are present at those known locations, and then expanding it out to try to find similar conditions at other places. And we chose random forest because it handles data differently than a typical regression algorithm. It's a classification tree. So it's able to handle what you might call a kitchen sink approach to environmental variables. We threw a lot at it, but it's able to tease out what is important or not. Sometimes you don't know what's important until you throw it at it and run it. It also can handle variables that seem really correlated and won't impact the model as much as it would for traditional regression sort of models. And also, it's pretty good at handling multiple solutions. For example, if the taxa are in different habitats across their range, if it's in one situation in the north versus the southern part of its range, it's going to be able to have those multiple solutions. And lastly, it outputs a raster, basically of probabilities, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. The first thing we needed to do was to develop the training data by gathering all the known locations that we possibly could for all 10 species. We asked our network partners, other heritage programs, and we also asked for other data if we could find out about it from Fish and Wildlife or the Forest Service and other sources. We got a pretty good response. But we still had a lot of issues that we needed to address as we were doing this. For example, some records were very old or very vague. You see these great big ones. Those won't do anybody any good for a model. But where do we cut off? What's too old? What's too vague? We had to figure out if we could infer habitat. For example, if we heard a frog calling from a wetland, should we include the entire wetland or just the exact point where the frog was calling? We needed to make sure it was biologically meaningful. For example, if the snake was crossing the road isn't really biologically meaningful for that species, but how do we capture adjacent habitat that might be? So every single polygon, 2,148 of them, was reviewed to remove unsuitable habitat and to figure out some of these other questions. And every polygon is also assigned a value that we call representational accuracy, or RA. If it wasn't already assigned by a heritage program. RA is basically a qualitative value from very low to very high that reflects the certainty that a map location represents the actual observed location. So, for example, if you have a GPS point right over the top of a rare plant, or maybe exactly along the border edge of where the rare plants are, that would have a very high representational accuracy, assuming your GPS is pretty good. But a polygon that might be developed from, say, a museum record where the label just says Pine Woods 1 mile east of town, might get, it's going to be mapped very differently. It's going to be more vague. You hope that you actually captured where that specimen was collected. And so it might get a RA of something called medium or low or something like that. You know it's probably within that area, but you're uncertain as exactly where that was collected. So we looked at every single polygon, and one of the first things we did was just remove unsuitable habitat. And these images here have a couple of examples. So this is an upland species. I believe this was Ruth Michowii. It doesn't occur in the bottomland, so we removed some of the bottomland. The purple lines are how the data were given to us. The EO, or the source feature. An EO is comprised of source features. So this is considered one population of the plant, but every single one of these is a different observation for it. So it's called a source feature. Or I may just refer to them as polygons throughout the talk. But we removed bottomland habitat. We removed roads. We would have removed buildings if possible. And if there was ever overlap like here and here, we would remove basically one polygon. So it was just covered by one of the polygons. There wasn't double coverage. For the hognose snake, where an awful lot of the observations were along roads, we needed to figure out how to make that kind of more meaningful. In this one, cutting off the road still left pretty adequate amount of habitat, and nothing needed to be done. But this one and others, where it was right on top of the road, and you're basically catching mainly mowed area and things like that, that's not so meaningful. We would buffer it out and then capture that habitat. If it's buffered by 100 meters, it's pretty reasonable to assume that a snake might move 100 meters. Could have come from any one of these directions. So that's how we handled that. A couple more examples for the amphibians. They were a little bit different. On the left here, the red is the EO data, the source feature. And this is a pretty vague one. I'm not sure if it was a low or a medium, but it's pretty vague. So what we did was try to capture just the wetland communities within that, which is the shaded here. And in this example, we had really pretty precise information about the wetland, but we also are aware that the amphibians can move. And in talking with experts, kind of decided on a general buffer of 700 meters and tried to capture all the wetlands within that 700 meter buffer. All right. So while we were doing all this training data development, we were also developing the predictor variables from the environmental data. And this was the whole Eastern regional team, so New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, and us, deriving all of these from different sets. And each office would basically be in charge of one of these. For example, I think all the derivatives we got from the MED we did in-house, so they were all using common tools. And these were developed from Maine through Florida, so the whole Region 5 and the South Atlantic. So it's one continuous environmental variable, again, at 30-meter resolution. And this is a fun slide. So it's pretty busy, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of how random forest works, but I did want to just touch on a few things. Reminding you that it's an inductive approach, going from specific, the known locations, and infers things out to general locations. It does this by basically building thousands of classification trees, thousands of these, or what you would call a forest, and it bases each tree on randomly selected presence points, pseudo-absent points, and the environmental variables. Each node will get a different set of randomly selected environmental variables. This randomization contributes to the robustness of the model. The very last step, you get all these trees, and you get each one of these would be like vote, takes a vote, present, absent. The tree will vote as to how it might fall out. Then you take every raster cell for your coverage, and you run it through every single tree. And as a as it votes for that one raster cell, the thousands of trees, you basically get what the probability between 0 and 1 of what that raster cell would be of habitat being suitable or similar to the known locations. So this is an example of the raster output. You can see that every cell has a value from 0 to 1. Using the very lowest probabilities, it's really kind of darker reds out here. It's not really going to add to any conservation decision support. Choosing only the very highest, however, which would be here, you get this kind of bullseye effect, is likely not going to, it's likely going to tell you exactly what you already know, which is where it is. So somewhere in between is the sweet spot of adding decision-making value. It's a balance between general probability and credibility. If we ask for a survey at any site above 0.01, we're going to lose credibility with those asking for a project review, perhaps. But we don't want such a high threshold either, where it eliminates truly suitable habitat, and you also could determine the location of the sensitive species. So choosing that cutoff value or the threshold can vary, but I'm going to get back to talking about thresholds in just a second, because I also want to point out one other product that we are producing with these models, which is our metadata sheets, which are fairly standardized. It includes information about the input training data, validation statistics, importance of the different environmental variables, these things called partial plots over here for the top 9 variables. It gets into different threshold variable options. It will show the full model and also some literature cited. These are going to be available with each one. So getting back to threshold options and focusing on that page 3 of the metadata. The values are calculated by random forest and can help us determine the threshold. One of the values is called this maximum of sensitivity plus specificity, or the MSS. And for those familiar with the ROC curve, or ROC, I'm not sure which, it's the upper leftmost point on the curve, and it's basically the maximum of the true positive plus the true negative. The NCP, the minimum training presence value, is the lowest probability value for one of the raster cells that allows all the training presence points to be included within that threshold. When we did our first run of the model, we noticed that some of the threshold values for NCP in particular were pretty low. And so we came up with two other methods, NCP by element occurrence, or EO, and NCP by polygon. I have a couple of slides here to help kind of elucidate what all of that means. So looking at the NCP options. So the schematic on the left is what I'm it's just a schematic. It's representational. It's called a full raster. I've categorized it into 10 different categories just for visualization purposes. Again, note kind of this bullseye effect where it's known. The black circles represent the polygons. The green dots represent presence points used as training data in the model. Again, and I'm just saying that these two polygons comprise EO number 1, and this is a separate population, EO number 2. So for the NCP, it's going to take the presence point that has the lowest raster cell value. Here, I'm just calling it 0.4, so that all presence points are included. So if you make 0.4 your threshold, you might get a screening coverage that looks like this. Now, screening layer, it's basically, again, the threshold, and it's just within here, we're considering it possibly suitable habitat, and here it's not. So it's just binary that way, and we use it for project review. It helps to guide our conservation decisions and when actions are triggered. But again, it's such a broad thing here with the 0.4, you can see where it might actually capture a lot of really unsuitable habitat. So we tried the minimum training presence by polygon. Again, actually all of these are the exact same values of 0.07, but the we did this by taking the minimum of the maximums for each polygon. So we wanted to assure that each input polygon has at least one presence point within it that is classified as suitable. So the maximum for this one is 0.7, 0.9, and 0.8. So from this set of 7, 8, and 9, the minimum number is 0.7. So using that threshold, we get this screening layer that looks this way. It's a lot reduced from what it was, and it may be a little better at capturing suitable habitat without giving away EO location too much. And lastly, we tried it by using element occurrence, or EO, as kind of the sampling unit. So what is the maximum value for this entire EO would be 0.9. What's the maximum value for this EO is 0.8. So taking the minimum of that set is 0.8, and you would use that threshold, you develop this. Now notice that this whole polygon gets missed with this method. And it may be, it doesn't show up in this example so well, but it may be that you might be right on top of your known locations, and it could give away sensitive information. So it's just something to keep in mind. But once you start to think through all of these thresholds, you have to really think about what you're going to be using them for. You might use a different threshold for different purposes. You may want a lower threshold that selects more area if you're developing a screening layer. But if you're trying to inform field inventory and find new occurrences, you may want a higher level of probability. So the images here, I have a full raster with classified data or stretched data here. And this is the same using I think I use this 0.5 value here. They're pretty darn close. You can't really tell a difference. And these little dark areas are the actual EOs. So the lower value might be used for environmental screening, and we would be willing to share this with the public, as it's probably pretty difficult to pinpoint the exact location of a sensitive species using this sort of layer. This image, though, is the NCP by EO. It's much higher, it's 0.9, and it might be considered sensitive information, because at this point you might be able to actually find where these species are. But you might try to use this to inform, where do I go look? This might be an interesting area here, that might be an interesting area up there. It's pretty high probability that it's very similar to where the known occurrences are. But also note that there are a few occurrences here, because this would all be taken from one EO, that are not, they're outside the threshold. Lastly, once we've run the models, we've had a couple of rounds of reviewing. In January, we sent out the first version, and this past June, we sent out the second for review, mainly using ArcGIS Online for access to look at the models and also the metadata. We provided guidelines for how to think through the review process, mainly don't do it pixel by pixel, but bottom line kind of ask, would you conduct a survey in that area? Would it be suitable for screening coverage for additional review? Would you be willing to go do inventory there? We asked heritage biologists, fish and wildlife personnel. I think we put it out on the South Atlantic website to ask for input. So we're trying to get reviews in. And in general, what we got back, at least after the first round and somewhat in the second round here, is that excuse me, I didn't mean to switch yet, is that the model is tending to overfit a little bit, and on the opposite end, it's also picking up some inappropriate habitat. For example, it's picking up bottomland for what might be an isolated wetland species. So we're trying to figure out and go forward with how to respond to each of these. And we also got a few notes that we may have been missing some data, so I think we've rerun a couple of our models since then, adding a few known locations. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some decision points and results.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great. Okay, so on this slide, we're just outlining some of the specific decisions that our team made. Again, the team consisting of both the South Atlantic and Region 5 folks. So these are decisions that we made to sort of customize our modeling method. They wouldn't necessarily have to be done in any random forest approach. The first one was, so as Anne mentioned, our EO occurrence data has different representational accuracies based on its precision, and we made the decision that we wanted to weight our training data by that precision, because with high representational accuracy, you have a lot more confidence that the area you're mapping is really suitable habitat and occupied by the species, as opposed to some of the lower ones where there's stuff in there that we were able to identify as suitable, but we're less confident that the species is actually in that location. So we did weight our training data by that. Also with environmental variables, we made a few decisions. Several of our input layers were what we call distance rasters. In other words, if the source layer was maybe like a geology layer of a certain type of geology, rather than just scoring it as it's in that type or not, we actually did a distance to that type. That gives us a continuous variable, which is generally a more robust, stronger input variable. But some of those areas are, for a given species, were way beyond the extent of the species and pretty clearly irrelevant. And so we made some decisions to exclude certain distance rasters if they were really far away from that species. We had a few issues with developing some of our variables. Depressional wetlands, for example, presented a challenge in terms of the land cover data. They weren't always well identified, and we tried to look at our elevation data to look at closed depressions there, and that helped a little bit, but it was still a bit of a challenge. So we just wanted to note that we had some issues with things like that. The threshold value Anne already talked about, and this is obviously a real key to how you end up using the models. And we looked at a variety of different thresholds and ended up choosing several to report in our metadata. And I would say we still don't have a real consensus on a single threshold that should always be used in all cases. They're really, they're going to vary by model and by what your intended use for the models are. But the ones we ended up kind of honing in on were, as Anne mentioned, the minimum training presence and the maximum sensitivity and specificity, together with those modifications of MTP by EO and Polygon. Also, as Anne mentioned, some of our initial models, the feedback we got was that they looked like they were really overfitting. They were showing up really tight around the known locations. So we looked at a couple of ways to tweak that. One was we subset the environmental variables for each model. So again, some of the ones that were clearly irrelevant to a given species would not have been included. And then we also looked at the number of background points and sort of realized that based on our methods, we had far more background points than we had occurrence points. And so it's possible that the background data was kind of swamping the model and suggesting that there's nowhere suitable except those areas that we have occurrence data. So we balanced out background points to occurrence data for that reason. Next slide. So we're just going to show you a few examples of the model results. We don't really have time to go into detail with all of the species we modeled, but I'll just highlight a few. First, here's the striped newt. On the left, you see the full model showing the full probability from 0 to 1. The tiny little red dots are our occurrence locations. So yellow would be high probability and blue would be the lowest. And then on the right, I'm showing the different thresholds, all four of the different thresholds that we kind of tended to focus on. In this case, you'll see that the MTP by Polygon and by EO were the same. And this follows kind of the same color scheme, although it's harder to see, but the dark blue would be the lowest threshold up to yellow being the highest. And what you see here is in areas where we had several populations within, vicinity of each other, The model was identifying a lot of area and potentially some new locations that would be worth examining. In some of the isolated populations, such as up in central Georgia, at this scale, you can't even see the model, but it does actually identify habitat around those, but it's still pretty tight around those known occurrences. Next slide. Here's the gopher frog. So this is a species that's a little bit more widespread, and so as a result, the model identified more habitat. Again, the full spectrum model on the left with red indicating the known occurrences. This one gets up into North Carolina. And then on the right, you see the threshold levels, and it's identifying a little more area. Note on the North Carolina coast, for example, it's got quite a stretch. We did get some feedback for this one that it doesn't seem to be distinguishing well enough between general wetlands such as bottomland forest and the more ephemeral breeding ponds that we were trying to focus on. So it's sort of a never-ending process of trying to tweak these, but we're at least at a good enough stage that we can consider this one final for the project. Next slide. And finally, here's one of our plant species, American chapseed. And here we had 4 distinct threshold values. So I just chose that so you could see a little more how those are breaking out. And again, this is sort of a good balance between the sort of tight focus around the known locations and some additional coverage identified. Keep in mind that these all, of course, are what we consider range-restricted species. That was kind of the point of the project. So it's not surprising that all of these models are going to tend to be, fairly tight around these occurrences. We're not expecting that these species would occur over broad areas, which you might find if you were modeling some more wide-ranging species. Next slide. So after we had all of our species completed, we wanted to look at some sort of summary data that might be useful for the South Atlantic and for the blueprint in particular. So here we just simply overlapped all of our species models using, I can't remember which threshold we're using here. It might have been the NCP, I think. But we're overlapping all of our species models. Let's see, that's a total of 10 species, is that correct?
10 species, and it's the NCP by Polygon, I believe.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And as you'll see here, the most overlap you get in any one location would be 4 species models, and those are in pretty small areas that are highlighted by the black circles there. But there's considerable area where at least 2 species overlap, and it kind of runs through that central corridor there. And that's where we might find some utility for the blueprint on the next slide. So here's the current blueprint, South Atlantic blueprint priorities, and obviously these are undergoing revisions as we speak, so we'll be updating this when they have their latest edition out. But this just kind of highlights that we have potential to show some additional areas that might be worth focusing on for the blueprint, and that's satisfying for us because that was kind of our initial goal with this project, was to try to help them fill in some gaps with some of these range-restricted species. Next slide. Here's just another example of kind of how you can look at this data. Here we're overlapping the PAD US, the public lands data, public conservation lands. Here we're only showing federal lands because they tend to be the larger areas, and it's a little less cluttered on the map. But you can see that several of these species, of course, are found on federal lands, and you can see there's also overlap there. So those kind of represent key hubs, as most of us know. Next slide. So just a few known issues that we wanted to bring up about our modeling process. One thing we've thought about and struggled with a little bit, and mostly have had to put off until the future, is how do you deal with temporal issues where you have older occurrence data, but you're looking at current environmental data such as precipitation, temperature, vegetation coverage, and especially land use variables that are going to change more frequently over time. Another one would be some other projects we know have used fire return intervals as a predictor variable, and that's also a challenge. Is that's clearly a very dynamic variable. It's going to change over time and may not reflect what conditions were in your older data sets. So, we addressed that a little bit in terms of not including some of the oldest occurrence data that we had, but it would be great to sort of focus even more on that. We actually just recently came across a data set of historic land cover that's been developed, I believe, by USGS, and that might be really useful to overlay the land cover from a particular period of time. It goes back to like the 1930s, I believe, with some of our older occurrence data. That could be useful. Also, we were not able to include soils variables, which could be very important, especially for plant species. We worked with NRCS to try to get access to a lot of their soils data, but we just weren't able to get it compiled in a format that we could use for this project. But that's something, obviously, to work on for the future. Some of the environmental variables are highly correlated. Some of our reviewers pointed that out. We discussed that as well. We're pretty comfortable with that when using random forest because unlike a regression model where your independent variable correlation is a real issue, random forest kind of gets around this by looking at different suites of environmental variables to see how well they're predicting things, and it'll quickly leave out redundant variables if they're not adding a lot of information to the model. Finally, we did do a little bit of species-specific variable selection in terms of eliminating a few of our suite of variables that we knew weren't relevant for species, but you could go a lot further with this in terms of really highlighting environmental data that is probably key for a species, and maybe even developing some custom layers, some derived indices based on land cover, climate, and so on, that would be more relevant to your species, and that could probably improve the model considerably. Next slide. So I think this goes back to Anne, is that right?
I think so. Thanks, John. So just real quick, in addition to the models, we're also developing different species reports for each of the 10 species that will just have quick overviews of life history, conservation status, stressors and threats, suggest monitoring protocols and potential conservation actions. We'll also have a short overview of how the model performed and how we think that it may or may not be able to incorporate into the blueprint, and other identify areas for additional inventory and protection. And then finally, the cooperative is basically going to get the full rasters, which we consider sensitive data. We'll also suggest a screening layer for each species that it would be shareable on a website, and then a high probability raster to help inform additional protection or inventory that we would also consider sensitive data. So going forward, John mentioned the Blueprint 2.2 should be off the presses pretty soon. So we hope to look at the models that we've developed and evaluate them in the light of 2.2. We've done the big ramp up with all the environmental variables and an awful lot of polygon editing, but so we're kind of at the point where we can run random forest a lot right now if we got other species we wanted to do. With appropriate funding, of course, but we're at a good point where we could do that pretty efficiently. Ideally, we'd also find some funding to start developing similar models for similar purposes for riverine species and marine species, and we'd also love to figure out a way to make this an iterative process of indicating where inventory might be fruitful, and then getting the results of those inventory fed back into the model for updating. Lastly, maintaining the models is important. We kind of put a expiration date on these of about 5 years, because about every 4 or 5 years, you might expect land cover data to be updated or other environmental data. There also might be just improvements in modeling methods overall. So you don't want these to become stagnant, or you want them to stay as dynamic products to maintain. So lastly, just want to give a big thanks to everyone and all the programs and people that gave us data and shared their knowledge. Again, it's always a team effort to do conservation, and it's the same thing here. And that about wraps it up. So thanks to the South Atlantic for funding, and we'll take any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne and John. We do have plenty of time for questions, and I have one that's already come in through the chat box, so I'll let you ruminate on any other questions you might have while I go ahead and read this one out. Where can you access that USGS historic land cover data?
That just came out. There was a paper just published, and one of our team members pointed it out to us, so I just went and downloaded that data yesterday and just started looking at it. It's a 250 meter square cell raster, by the way, so it covers the entire U.S. I can send out the link. I can, let's see, yeah, I could maybe just email a link to the group or back to whoever might be able to distribute it.
Yeah, John, you could send it to me.
Okay.
And Michael, if you're interested in me passing that along, go ahead and send me your email address. Anybody else have questions? Just *6 to unmute, or you can type into the chat box if you prefer. Really? No questions?
Hi, I just wanted to, could you clarify what the end product is going to be that's available to field offices for use? It's just a layer on the blueprint. We won't have access to the full raster data.
I need to go back and read the contract. So the field offices, I think, would get the screening layer. I think it would be up to the cooperative if they wanted to share out the full raster data.
Ruud, are you interested in commenting on that?
So basically, the one stipulation we had was not sharing the sort of the full continuous raster layer publicly. But I think that question of can we make sure the field offices have, as long as they don't distribute it publicly, the full raster layer? That would be a good question for you, Anne and John. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to do that as long as it's not shared publicly. What do y'all think about that, the full continuous layer?
I think it's fine. I think there would need to be some discussion, maybe a webinar once we pass it out, to just kind of what you can and can't do with the model, what it is and isn't saying, just so that it's very clear that the field offices are using it appropriately. Yeah.
Right. I guess my main interest is that we may have multiple models for a similar species, because FWC, I believe, was doing some flatwood salamander modeling. Different approach. You guys only did one species. There are two species. I'm kind of trying to, how can we cover the range of both species and compare the different model results, pros and cons for each model. So I guess that's ultimately my goal. Plus, I thought I read that Region 5 was potentially using some of these to do ranges for IPAC. I'm not sure if you guys will be into the weeds on that, but I also was kind of interested in what product they were ultimately going to use to create that current range in IPAC.
Yeah. So for the IPAC, we're hoping to suggest to them an appropriate threshold to use for IPAC. Here in Virginia, we have had good luck with our field office using models that we've developed without this particular methodology, but we've developed in the last 6 or 7 years, and it's really helped to streamline their review process. So we're trying to scale that success up to Region 5. So we're still kind of testing the waters, if you will, to do it on that large of a scale. So hopefully we'll have good results.
Thanks. Good questions. Whatever is publicly available, I'm sure we'll put up on the Conservation Planning Atlas for review independently, as well as the blueprint itself. However, this ends up being incorporated in a future version. Anyone else want to jump up with a question?
Yeah, this is Rick Tabro. I was wondering, are the same 10 species used in the North Atlantic LCC, and then how transferable might those species be to peninsular Florida?
I'm not familiar with work going on in the North Atlantic LCC. For the Region 5 work, it was 7 species. The only overlap was the chapsy, which is the only current occurrence in the north is New Jersey. We actually did try to run it from the entire region and got pretty poor model results. So they're being run in the different regions. I can't speak to Peninsular Florida. John, do you want to take a stab at that?
So in terms of whether these can be transferable to Peninsular Florida, I wasn't sure what the question meant.
I was just wondering if you could, if there were similar species down in Florida, or would you have to go through this sort of same process of identifying a new suite of species to run the model?
Yeah, I think you would want to look at species that are particular to that area, just because there are so many different species located only in the peninsula. But certainly some of these we could run, their ranges do extend further south, so we could do that.
Yeah, and this is real, Rick, and one of the reasons we were trying to pull this out is that there are some of these kind of unique range restricted species, and trying to see how well the current blueprint covers it and fill gaps. But there are some niches, some of these disturbance dependent plants and other components that may be different species, but they point out some kind of larger ecological patterns that we might be missing. Like the one that Anne brought up, you saw that some of the increasing highlight of the fall line, which we've talked about a lot, as that importance, whereas kind of systems mix and hadn't been as disturbed. So it's interesting how some of these, even these more range-restricted species, point out some larger ecological patterns that are going to be important into the future and might connect with some of the other stuff. In the North Atlantic, I think they have a layer that they use. I'm not sure how. I mean, they basically pull in a lot of the element occurrence data, and I'm not sure the details of how they buffer or apply that, but I think they use the kind of element occurrences themselves directly in the North Atlantic.
Yeah, I thought the work was great, and of course I loved seeing the fall line.
Yeah, I knew you would.
Lighting up.
We could probably take one or two more if anyone else wants to speak up.
I'd add one other thing. Part of some of those species came out because when we tested the TNC resilience, which is intended to capture a lot of these sort of more range-restricted endemic species, there were certain certain species that weren't captured very well, including some of the threatened endangered plants and a few of the herps. And so that's partly what led to this piece is a known gap in sort of one of our indicators that we're supposed to be capturing some of these things.
All right, well, hearing no more questions, I'm going to wrap up just with a preview of next month's web forum and a few updates from the staff of your cooperative. Bear with me while I share my slides again. So next month, we're going to be hearing from Rua, our science coordinator, on August 17th. It'll be the same time, same connection information. We'll be getting an overview of the latest and greatest iteration of the Conservation Blueprint, which is version 2.2. Your staff have been working hard to incorporate all the feedback on the draft version of 2.2 that we received through the spring workshop series. And so Rua is going to discuss how this version of the blueprint was put together, any known issues that we have with it, how to access the data. So definitely would encourage you to tune in next month for that. A few updates from the staff. We don't have too much new to report since our updates on last month's web forum, but as I said, we're continuing to work on Blueprint 2.2, making those changes in response to workshop feedback. Hoping to get the blueprint released this fall and be ready for that web forum in August. And then we're also working on some improvements to the latest version of the blueprint as accessed on the simple viewer, trying to make it easier to understand why areas are priority in the blueprint, exploring a potential new feature that would allow you to upload a shapefile and do some reporting. Rua, did you have anything to add on either of those?
I think we're made progress on some issues with the historic areas that a few folks pointed out, and then fingers crossed we might have an improvement around some of the places that folks were looking at in some of the forested wetlands ecosystems that weren't coming out as highly as you might expect. So we're pretty close. Fingers crossed. We're hoping to be able to bake that into the next version of the blueprint. And then on the simple viewer, I think particularly one of the cooler things we've got in the works is this sort of been calling the Pixel Hunter feature. Will actually get you to look at each individual pixel and dive into all the indicators and more details about it. So we got a couple of cool improvements in the viewer and hopefully some good improvements in the blueprint before it comes out.
Yep, so a lot to look forward to. You'll be hearing more about that as it emerges. So I always end on this slide. If you're looking to get more involved, I'd encourage you to join our website at southatlanticlcc.org. That'll get you signed up for our monthly newsletter and a reminder email about this web forum. You can always connect with your staff, with me, with Rua, with Mallory, with Amy. Please feel free to explore the blueprint online. Your staff are here to support you if you're looking to incorporate that into your decision making. With that, I'll pause for questions again. If anyone would like to speak up, *6 to unmute. All right, well, we're ending a little early, 5 minutes. So that's it from us. Thanks again, Anne and John, for presenting. Really appreciate you all attending and hope you join us next month. Have a good rest of the week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.